Hello and welcome to The First Draft, a new podcast by the Foreign Policy Research Institute in which we'll examine the ideas emanating from world affairs over the next few months. I'm Robert Kaplan, Robert Strauss Houpe Chair in Geopolitics.
And I'm Dominic Green, Senior Fellow in the FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. Hello and welcome to The First Draft, a podcast from the Foreign Policy Research Institute with Robert D. Kaplan, the FPRI's Robert Strauss Houpe Chair in Geopolitics, and me, Dominic Green, a Senior Fellow at the FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. Robert, we don't often talk about 18th century clergymen, but this month we're leading off with him. You've got an article in the latest issue of the New Statesman on Thomas Malthus. And before we go any further, you should remind me, and indeed everybody, exactly who Malthus was and what his trap is.
Right. Well, Malthus was one of the figures of the Enlightenment. And he is mostly remembered, in fact, completely remembered by both liberals, conservatives, anyone you want to think of as someone who is a dire pessimist and doomsayer who got the big question wrong. And the question is, he said that eventually, as humankind increased in numbers, food supplies would run out. Now, that's the beginning and end of most of the knowledge about Malthus. And that is an example of an extremely narrow version of the truth. In fact, Malthus admitted that he was wrong during his lifetime and reevaluated and redrew his population theory no fewer than 6 times until ultimately admitting that, he couldn't get it right. But the larger message of Malthus's life's work is undeniable. And that is because Malthus was the first great philosopher who emphasized that humankind was a species in nature, was part of an ecosystem of plants, water resources, everything. And that as humankind increased in numbers, the strain on the ecosystem would increase as well. And that could lead to a diminishment in the quality of life. See, Malthus should be remembered as the philosopher of limits rather than the philosopher of getting population wrong. So whenever we read about water shortages anywhere in the world, or the depletion of nutrients in the soil anywhere in the world, or the depletion of just about anything, and about the struggles of urban life in shanty towns in Latin America and Africa and parts of Asia, we're really in a Malthusian world. So my thesis in this essay is that even though the world population is aging because the rates at which population grows is slowing down, particularly in the developed countries, that is not in contradiction to Malthus's theory. Absolute numbers, we're putting more people on the earth than ever before. So for a few decades more, before populations truly level off and we have more technological advances to deal with it, we'll be living in a Malthusian world. And this is particularly true in sub-Saharan Africa and other places where the populations are aging at a far, far slower rate than in places like China or Northern Europe, etc.
So the Malthusian trap is clearly in evidence in sub-Saharan Africa, where population is rising faster than, say, food supply. But in other areas of the world, it isn't. And like oxygen, population has become fungible in our connected world, and you can easily move from one region to another. So the absolute numbers are, in a sense, what counts, because you could say, the population of Italy or Japan is aging and aging, and its food supply is stable, and so therefore there is no Malthusian trap in those countries. But in other regions, of course, there is. Did Malthus think much about the political implications of this, or was he more interested in the question of whether simple sustainable population would be possible?
Yeah, he inferred that politics would get harder, would just become much more fraught and difficult because of the struggle to accommodate more and more people. His great mistake was to put a fixed number and specific prediction on all this, which of course never holds true. So, as I say at the end of the piece, Malthus will continue to be disparaged, even as he continues to be more and more relevant, at least for the next few decades.
I mean, one case, in a way, of Malthus's theory being not so much disproven as sidestepped by human ingenuity would be the introduction of nitrogen into farming, which made agricultural yields hugely increase and so on. Another would be the Green Revolution, which is usually forgotten about. Now, today, when we say Green Revolution, we tend to think of environmental projects as opposed to affect GM, in other words, the development of hardy or strains of rice or rice that needed less water, which supported massive population growth in Asia. In the middle and later part of the 20th century. So technical ingenuity is one answer to this. Meanwhile, as I said, the political aspect is something which has become more and more apparent. Immigration appears to be the key shaper of politics in the US and across Europe as well.
Let me just say one more thing about Malthus. Even though we have technological fixes, his larger thesis that humankind exists in nature in an ecosystem is undeniable.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the very fact that there are fixes and they need to be high-tech technological fixes is proof of this.
Right, yeah. The system of nation states is being stressed by population movements. Political leaders are starting to pronounce upon this, and we're seeing a shift basically to the right across Europe. One of the events which not much fuss was made about in recent weeks was the 4th anniversary of Britain's departure from the European Union. And you can understand why no one was making a fuss about it, because it has not been well managed. And its defenders are increasingly finding themselves in the positions of people who used to say, well, real socialism has never been tried, so we should try again. Nevertheless, it turns out, like the election of Donald Trump in 2016, to have been a harbinger of huge political shifts. Do you think it's possible for countries to maintain access to global markets while effectively closing their borders to people, given the Malthusian pressures?
It's very, very hard. And migration from sub-Saharan Africa, from the war-torn Middle East, will continue steadily. And this will, of course, fuel populist politics in Europe, because Europe is not bordered by two oceans. It's close to Africa. It's close to the Middle East. People will want a better lifestyle. A better life. They will migrate. So populism is, I think, ingrained in Europe for the coming decades because of, indirectly in this case, Malthusian factors. And I think that as you wrote, last week, Britain is becoming a normal European country because its politics are becoming a little bit like Italy, like Hungary, like other places where, assuming the Labour Party the Conservatives lose the next election, in opposition, the Conservatives could go through a populist upheaval of sorts.
I think it's very likely, and it's reshaping politics in the United States as well. One event which happened, which didn't receive the attention I wondered if it should have received, is in early February, a Ukrainian, 6 sea drones, underwater drones, kamikaze drones, fired by the Ukrainians, launched from jet skis even, at a Russian guided missile ship called the Ivanovets, which was off the Crimean Peninsula, and sunk it almost immediately. And you can see footage of this on the internet. This to me seemed astounding. I read, and it may well be true, that this was the first time that a ship had been sunk in this manner, and it seemed, as it were, to represent a watershed in the nature of war and technology. What do you think?
Yeah, well, actually, for quite a few years now, there has been a fierce debate going on in defense policy circles in Washington about the future of the aircraft carrier. And this gets into what you're talking about. We're talking about the future of surface warships in general, because offensive missiles, whether fired by drones or whatever, offensive missile technology is improving at a faster rate than defenses against them, making surface warships more and more vulnerable than ever. So if you think about it, this was just a Russian ship. But can you imagine if a U.S. aircraft carrier were not sunk, but just disabled? It would be like another 9/11, in a sense, because the carrier has evolved into the greatest demonstration in one piece of US military power, given that nuclear weapons cannot practically be used.
Yes, and I'm reminded, of course, of in 1941 when the British sent two aircraft carriers east of Suez without air cover and without protection, and they were sunk before they got very far by Japanese bombers. This was viewed as a major shift in the use of them. And it would seem, as you're suggesting, that the age of the aircraft carrier may well be over.
Yeah.
I noted that if you wish to buy a missile ship like the Ivanovets, you can get one for around 60 to $70 million. The combined cost of the six kamikaze drone jet ski drone, so manufactured by the Special Techno Export Company of Ukraine, I notice, you can have the lot for between $1.5 and $2 million.
Yeah.
In other
So
words, the target
there
is
you
worth
see
30 times as much.
yeah. And remember, a carrier with the jets on it is like $20 billion, a
Yeah.
single carrier.
Yeah.
Uh, so, the good thing about carriers, about this carrier debate, is that we build one at a time. So we can't get the whole thing wrong. We can get one carrier too wrong. We could build one carrier too many or so. So this is an
Mhm.
ongoing debate. And you also see the disconnect between the little it costs to attack and the immense cost to defend in the Red Sea.
Yeah.
With because what this is basically a third world military using
Mhm.
cheap weapons, destabilizing a geopolitical choke point,
Yeah.
and basically fighting the US with its tens of billions of dollars of equipment to a draw.
I have some numbers on this as well. The Burkan 3 missile that the Houthis are using, which is derived from the Scud missile, the Cold War era Soviet missile, which many people remember from the first Iraq War. Hezbollah are said to make a basic version for $400 a unit. And this is obviously the longer range, more powerful one, so it may actually cost four figures. The missiles being fired at the Houthis, on the other hand, cost between $2 million per unit and $4.3 million, which
Yeah.
is, I mean, obviously there is a great deal of money available for this, but sooner or later, this is the most expensive way of fighting a very cheap weapon.
Yeah, and what this gets to is a larger, almost philosophical question, Dom, which is the leveling out of military power. That the great industrial nations don't have the advantage that they used to have in many kinds of war. Now, it'll be a different case if we ever see high-end warfare in the Pacific Rim with China, the US, Japan fighting, but we haven't seen that yet. And in the meantime, this is what we have. What we're seeing is an imbalance, a real imbalance in what it costs to attack and what it costs to defend.
There is, I remember a line, I think it's by Hilaire Belloc, the Edwardian poet and bigot, who said, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." And of course, you're right. This has this technological balance has shifted, and you have people using very cheap weapons and then fighting them with very expensive ones. How advanced is the United States' drone research and drone programs?
Well, it used to be leading the world. At the very beginning, I remember going out to North Las Vegas, Nevada in 2006 to do a profile of a unit that was then called unmanned aerial vehicles. For some reason, I forgot they hated the word drone,
Mm.
and they said drone should not be used. Of course, that changed. And this was a breakthrough. They were using these to fight the Iraq War, essentially. And it was like a breakthrough story, because
Mhm.
nobody else was doing it. But you see how the world has caught up, in a copycat fashion, that it's harder and harder to keep technological secrets to yourself, because even when the adversary cannot break the code, it can simply copy the whole idea, the whole concept, and do it on their own. And also has been an American notion that these countries are not sophisticated enough to do this kind of thing. Well, that's been shown to be false.
And you can buy drones from Amazon. They are universally available now.
Yeah, yeah,
One thing which is not universally available really is say the F-16, and this is one area in which the United States retains a massive advantage is in air power. On the other hand, air strikes as deterrents appear to me are they losing their value? Because in the 1990s there was something astonishing about it, but these days it doesn't seem to work in quite the same way.
No, in fact, here again, drones are taking over. Why risk a human life with all of the redundant systems on board a plane that are required to preserve that human life that causes planes, a single fighter jet, to cost in the tens of millions of dollars? I think some cases hundreds of millions. I can't remember quite exactly when a drone can do it. You see, I think we may be in a situation where the last human fighter jet pilot has already been born.
That's astounding.
Yeah,
Yeah. I believe it. Now, we are watching this ongoing war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and you're seeing there a very complicated mixture of tactics and means and so on. In what way does this illustrate the evolving nature of war? Because there's been some considerable ingenuity involved, for instance, in tunnel warfare.
yeah. Well, first of all, the media loves novelty. And for weeks at a time, there's no more novelty in the Gaza war. The Israelis are doing the same thing over and over again. So there's this assumption that Israel is losing or it's been defeated simply because there's no more novelty, nothing new to report. But that's wrong. First of all, one of the reasons why there's less and less new to report is because the Israeli military does not leak like the American military does. So you see very few stories, almost none, from inside the Israeli chain of command saying we got this wrong or that wrong. The stories are mainly from what the Israeli military spokesman has told reporters when they get things wrong. In other words, it's been cleared already. So that we're not seeing the leaks, so the story gets dull or loses novelty value, and therefore this assumption that Israel is not making progress. But in fact, it's been making great progress just through attrition. It's gone from North Gaza to Central Gaza, and now fighting in Southern Gaza in this methodical destruction, and then the destruction of the tunnels, which the first day was a news novelty story, but it goes on for weeks and weeks, and it stopped being reported. And to me, what's astounding is that the Americans, with all their complaining, have been letting it happen. The Europeans are not complaining as much. They're not demanding a cessation. The Saudis and the Egyptians and the Gulf Arabs have been holding fast. They don't like this. They're afraid of their street, but they haven't been issuing ultimatums in any way, at least as of today when we talk. So the Israelis are proceeding.
And
I
they've
would think.
so far the number of soldiers killed is much lower than projected.
Yes,
And
yes.
this is one of those things like the dog that didn't bark. This is actually a highly significant development, demonstrating it's possible to fight well embedded enemies in densely urban situations without high casualty numbers.
I can tell you, as someone who covered the first Battle of Fallujah in 2004 in Iraq, April 2004, urban combat is exceedingly complex and dangerous. And so the relative low numbers of Israeli casualties is astounding. And not only is that the dog that didn't bark, the other dog that didn't bark that I mentioned previously is the leaks from
Right.
inside the Israeli military establishment, which attests to the unity, to the
Mm.
operational unity, that the only thing reporters are going to hear are from our official spokesman, which we tell them it's okay to tell them.
This seems to contrast quite sharply to the administration's handling of the killing of 3 servicemen and women in late January, where the nature and timing of the US response was signaled very carefully, presumably to avoid killing Iranian personnel. This was an attempt to send a signal, both I suspect that the US doesn't want a war with Iran, but also domestically to show the population that it's doing something. We talked about Malthus's trap. Is there a possibility that the Biden administration is drifting into Jimmy Carter's trap of?
Well, yes, because the Biden administration is between two unpalatable things. One is it doesn't want a major war with Iran because a major war of a sitting president would hurt his reelection chances, unless it could be wrapped up triumphantly before election day. And wars don't end triumphantly the way they used to. So that's on one extreme. And the other extreme is, as long as we just keep hitting their proxies to avoid a major war, Iran is basically setting the narrative and the agenda, because Iran can take attacks on their proxies from America. What it can't take, what upsets its grand strategy, if you will, is if America were to strike something in Iran itself. And so the Biden administration is playing Iran's game on one hand, and yet at the same time is afraid that if it attacks Iran, it will ignite a major war, which will hurt its reelection chances in another way. There's the Jimmy Carter way. There's also the other way of being caught in a major war on election day.
Yeah,
So it's a very unpalatable situation for the Biden administration.
it's not one that I can imagine that the Iranians are going to be in a hurry to let them off the hook on either, given that
No,
this is a
no.
matter of survival
The
for the
other
Iranian
thing, though,
regime as
is,
well.
yeah, the other thing is the Iranians could get too clever in the sense that they could hurt Biden and therefore help Trump be reelected. And then if Trump is the president again, it was Trump who killed Qasem Soleimani. Trump is unpredictable. Because he's unpredictable, he's more likely to attack Iran. So, it's not as if the Iranians have no calculations of their own that are very difficult to make.
That's very true. And I just remembered, of course, that it was Trump who created the Space Force, a new division of the US military, talking of these changes in military technology and budgets and planning and so on. It is often the case that war is an accelerant of technological ingenuity.
War is an accelerant of a lot of things, as we know.
Including the Malthusian trap as well, because one thing it does is interrupt food production as well as oil production.
Yeah, yeah. But that's another thing. A major war or an attack on Iran would probably lead to oil prices going up, both directly and indirectly. And that would hurt Biden in his reelection chances as well. One thing I heard at a conference is that the Saudis don't want to pump more oil. They're happy with a high oil price because they don't want to help Biden be reelected. They would much rather deal with Trump.
This is, yeah, that's astounding in itself, and from
Yeah,
their
when you
point of view,
think
you can see
about that.
why.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Well, this is where we are and where we'll shortly be. Thank you, Robert, as always. You've been listening to The First Draft, a podcast from the Foreign Policy Research Institute with Robert D. Kaplan and Dominic Green. Join us again next month. Until then, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to The First Draft on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more podcasts and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.